It's February 5th, 1909, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
When Time magazine put Leo Baekeland on their cover, he was so famous that they didn't need to explain to the public who he was. This despite him being a chemist, a celebrity chemist. They didn't mention his name, just the words, "It will not burn. It will not melt." What they were referring to, they knew their readers would instantly understand, was what he announced today in history in 1909. His invention of the first thermosetting resin, the plastic known as Bakelite.
Yeah, and you can understand why he called it Bakelite, considering its chemical name is polyoxybenzylmethyl-anglicolin-hydride, which doesn't quite trip off the tongue in the same way that Bakelite does.
You can't put that in front of jewellery.
No, exactly. But it is interesting that he was experimenting without entirely knowing what his end point was, and he discovered this substance almost a little bit by accident.
Yeah, Bakeland's original specialty was photographic technology. He was an associate professor of chemistry at the University of Ghent, which is where he was from. And in 1889, he'd been offered basically a bursary to visit universities in the US, and he and his wife Celine decided to stay there.
His wife Celine, who, by the way, was the daughter of the professor at the university he was teaching at. So,
I mean, it's a little cozy, isn't it?
Whatever you got to do to get ahead.
His specialty had been photography, and he'd already invented a new process for developing photographic plates in water. And then in 1893, he hit the big time. He invented an improved photographic paper that he called Velox, the first commercially successful paper for developing film. And that helped make photography an accessible mainstream hobby, not something that you had to be a really techie weirdo to grasp. And in 1899, he and his partners sold their company, which they called Nepera, to former retrospector subject George Eastman of the Eastman Kodak Company. He got about $200,000 personally from that, which he used to buy a house in Yonkers, New York, where he set up his own top-of-the-range lab. The only downside, this is a bit like, the thing about hell where you've got soup spoons that don't quite reach your mouth. He was now financially comfortable and had plenty of time to do what he wanted. He was only 36, but the one thing that he couldn't work on was his passion. Part of the deal when he sold the company was that he wasn't allowed to do any professional work in the field of photographic technology for 20 years. So he had to look for something new to get into. So he
Which
decided...
is so weird, isn't it? Why didn't Kodak just offer him a job?
Yeah, it seems so short-sighted.
I know, the whole thing is very odd. I don't understand how this came about, but he decided to move into industrial chemicals, obviously, quite a related field, specifically the development of synthetic resins. And the thing that I found really interesting about this was the industrial chemical industry was basically all about cloth dye. It was different ways to develop dyes and how to, there were no synthetic plastics on the market. So it was a relatively niche interest. There was this understanding that a substance like what we now know as plastic would be incredibly useful. But because there weren't any, most of the industrial chemists were just coming up with new ways to, make better cloth dyes.
Well, the kind of early plastics that there were, or predecessor plastics, if you like, were based on plants like cellulose. That was used in billiard balls when people realised it wasn't such a great idea. They were so dependent on ivory to play pool. But when they started putting plant-like material into billiard balls, the problem was they explode when you hit them too hard.
Let's go back to killing the elephants.
It adds a whole new dimension to the game, explosive billiards.
So there were a lot of areas where, as you said, they sort of didn't know what the solution was they were looking for, as in literally the chemical solution. But they knew they needed an answer to the question, how can we have something that's durable and moldable? And I said, what's really cool, as you were suggesting, Arion, about the way that Baekeland went around innovating on this, was he had the money for his lab. He could just play. It was combining phenol with formaldehyde that gave him Bakelite, and it was just one of many experiments.
Well, he's one of those characters who, from a young age, just had this idea that it would be cool to be an inventor/entrepreneur, and he'd been fascinated as a kid by the popular accounts of the work of Thomas Edison and Alexander Bell, so much so that in 1933, in a diary entry, he recalled that the announcement of the transmission of speech by Bell's telephone telephone had made this enormous impression on him, he said, and he went about trying to build his own telephone as soon as he'd heard about that. And it seems to be the kind of through line for him. You know, as you were saying, Rebecca, by the time he had got his money, he just wanted his own lab, because even before he moved to the US, he was writing to his wife about being irritated by the fact that living in Ghent, he was surrounded by family who were constantly just interrupting him and stopping him from being able to work.
I get the vibe that Bakeland was a bit of a tall poppy for Belgium. I think he needed to move to the US. Because he was asked later, what was your inspiration? How did you come about it? And he basically said, I wanted to get rich. I wanted to find what's the next big thing that's going to make loads of money, and it's going to be these synthetic resins. So I just went and did that. He made no secret of the fact that he wanted to be wealthy and successful, which he was.
And he wasn't that bothered about dipping chips in ketchup rather than mayonnaise. He was prepared to make that sacrifice, even though the Americans have it wrong.
Life move.
It turns out that he was. The first thing that he produced was a synthetic shellac. Do you know the shellac is a natural substance? I did not know this. Actual shellac is a resin produced by lac beetles on trees. And obviously the issue with stuff like that is that if it's going to expand, you're going to need a lot of people gathering a lot of resin from a lot of trees. So there's sort of an inbuilt limit on how natural resins could be used. And so Bakeland made this synthetic shellac that he called Novalac using phenol, which is a compound derived from coal tar, and formaldehyde, which is derived from wood alcohol. These would be the ingredients that would go into Bakelite in the end. But although he was dissatisfied with the results, he was really intrigued by the potential, and he realised that if he just tinkered around with the formula, he could create exactly what was needed, because lots of other people were experimenting with synthetic resins, but it was really, really hard to get the formula right. Most of the resins which had been produced so far were either gooey, sticky liquids or really brittle solids.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, that the first substance that he struck on was going to be something that could be a replacement for shellac, because it just didn't have the qualities that Bakelite ultimately had, which was that it was the first commercial plastic that was completely synthetic, hot moldable, and once cooled produced a hard material that was resistant to heat, electricity, and solvents.
Yeah, so it doesn't mold again.
Yeah, exactly. And
because that's the thing, isn't it? You want to make a toy that still looks like an action figure. It doesn't disintegrate.
Yes, yeah.
When you put it in the sun.
Well, and the first thing that they had in mind for it was that, it became immediately apparent that it was going to be a good electrical insulator. But then people were just like, oh, wait a second, but we can use it for all sorts of things, like, as you say, toys or umbrella handles or pipe stems or bits of automobiles or, radios or just anything. Just suddenly you had this very, very useful substance that could be applied multiply.
Yeah, it was the kind of 3D printing of its day, wasn't it, really?
Right.
People knew that there was potential, but it needed lots of people to get involved to experiment with it to show them exactly what they could make out of it. I mean, if you look at Bakelite's own publicity material for what they'd invented, I'm talking about Bakelite as a company now, they had a slogan, for example, the material of 1,000 uses, which is actually dramatically underselling what you could do with Bakelite.
So at first, they mostly sold blocks of solid resin, which they marketed as artificial amber. So manufacturers would buy this artificial amber and they'd turn it into jewellery or cigarette holders. And actually, that use would continue for a surprisingly long time. Coco Chanel would design and sell Bakelite jewellery.
Oh, I love a bit of Bakelite jewellery.
It's lovely, but it's a material of 1,000 uses, not a material of one use. And this all changed in the early 1920s. When Bakelite hired Alan Brown, he marketed the product really aggressively as almost a magical material that could solve everyone's problems.
And economically hugely valuable to America as well, because it didn't rely on importing anything, unlike something like rubber. You didn't need to go anywhere around the world to have any components to make it. You could make it all by creating a chemical reaction within his factories in the US. And that's really important, again, to go back to the jewellery. Sorry, you heard my enthusiasm when you mentioned Bakelite jewellery. I mean, I don't have any because it is, I think, quite feminine, but I really love the way that it looks because it has that kind of caramelized sheen, like it would taste like a Werther's original, I always think. And that was really quite revolutionary in the sense that it's very cheap to make compared to something like a diamond where it's all about the cut and the carat and whatever. This is something that an industrial factory can produce but can be used as costume jewellery, where the value isn't that it comes from something that's been mined or there's no brand name to it. It's an industrial product reshaped into something that fits on your wrist, but because it's eye-catching, it is inherently beautiful, and that paved the way for all kinds of artificial fibres in fashion, which we still use now, nylon, spandex, polyester, etc.
And one of the lesser known of the 1,000 uses of Bakelite was that it actually solved an art mystery. This was the 1947 arrest of Han van Meegeren, who was a respected Dutch painter, but also, secretly, a very talented forger. He was finally exposed as a fraud after a Vermeer that he was hawking around was found to contain Bakelite because Van Meegeren had painted it himself and he'd used Bakelite as a paint hardener.
I just think if you're that good, you just deserve all the money. If you've painted a painting that is as good as Vermeer, then you're allowed to get away with it.
Well, the weird thing about Van Meegeren is he went on to be a national hero because it turned out afterwards that he had sold a fake portrait to Hermann Goering during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands.
What did he do with the real Vermeer? Maybe he made that into an ashtray and put the Bakelite in the painting.
Tomorrow.
Olga was Nicholas's sister. She came and met her, and she said, "That's not her."
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.